Hey guys, Jake Carlson here, host of the Modern Leadership Podcast. Are you ready to focus on amplifying your leadership superpowers? Let's go! Good morning, my friends and fellow elite achievers. Welcome to Modern Leadership, the podcast where each week we sit down with authors, entrepreneurs, and leaders to explore their journey, diving into the ups, their downs, and ultimately the lessons they learned along the way. Our goal, of course, is to show that everything is figure-outable. And today's guest expert is Bill Treasurer. Bill is a workplace expert, courage pioneer, and the best-selling author of 5 books, including celebrating its 10th anniversary edition, Courage Goes to Work, How to Build Backbones, Boost Performance, and Get Results, which we're going to dive into on this episode. I'm so excited about this. He is the founder of Giant Leap Consulting, a consulting and training company specializing in courage building. He advises organizations, many of which you will know and understand: NASA, eBay, Saks Fifth Avenue, Spanx, the Department of Veteran Affairs, and the Pittsburgh Pirates. Go Giants. On teaching workers the kind of courage that strengthens business and careers. Bill, it is so great to have you with us today. How are you?
Jake, I'm doing really well, and I'm so looking forward to our time together.
Well, I can't put your book down. I mean, it's been with me for the past probably 6 weeks since your team sent it over, and I just love it, and I want to dive into it. But before we do, we talked a little bit about your business background and what you're doing business-wise. Give us a little flavor of who you are on a personal level.
Sure. So I'm a dad. First and foremost, I'm a dad and I'm a husband, and I've got 3 children. I've got twin 16-year-olds. They'll be 16 next week. And then about a week after that, my little 12-year-old turns 13. So I've got Ian, my son, Alex, my other son, and Bina, my daughter. And that's the best of it right there. I'm coming to you today from my out office. We just built an office detached from my house. It's sort of next to the backyard. And it's pretty cool. It's slick. It's got the Wi-Fi. We're all settled in, so I'm in a good mood.
Wow, living the dream. I would love to put something in the backyard, something that I'm separated but not so far away that I can't just walk back and get a snack, maybe get a little exercise. Where are you located?
I'm in Asheville, North Carolina. The best thing about my little out office is, I love to write, so it allows me to cloister and still be close to my family, so I can go have meals and such. But also, like midday, if I want to sneak and take a nap, I have a bed in the loft. So it's pretty cool. So I live in Asheville, and believe it or not, Jake, we have. I would say I take walks most days that I'm home. I'm on the road mostly, but when I'm home, I take nice long walks, about an hour and a half, and I bet 70% of the time I see a bear or bears.
Oh my goodness, you are in a great location. As you talk about going on walks, and this week, I happen to be studying a new book, The $1 Trillion Coach, which is the story of Bill Campbell, who advised, Steve Jobs and some of the founders of Google and eBay and all these things. And one of the things that strikes me is these leaders that get out of their office and go for walks. Steve Jobs, known for going back up in the hills of Palo Alto and just walking. And so let me ask you, aside from seeing bears and the wildlife out there, what kind of mindset does this put you in as you get out and do this walking?
Yeah, and I can relate to what you said, and I've known that about Steve Jobs, and what turned me onto it, believe it or not, was Henry David Thoreau. It's his last book. He wrote a book called Walking. And it's about the importance of a long sauntering walk. And I can tell you what, for me, it does. First of all, it gives me a little bit of exercise, which is needed. But second of all, I'm often, get about halfway through the day and my brow is probably furrowing. And I'm probably tight and twined up with some business problem that I'm, hyperventilating about. And if I go and have a walk, I've never ended a walk not in gratitude. I may start the walk in a bit of anger or anxiety, but I always end my walks in gratitude. So when I'm on the walk, my whole disposition is changing and I'm opening up and I become receptive to a lot more ideas. And I get a lot of ideas from a long sauntering walk. And typically I'm not starting the walk thinking, I need to figure this problem out, but I'm sort of just experiencing it. But then ideas start to flow into me.
Now, when you go for walks, are you mostly going in stillness and quiet, or are you listening to podcasts, listening to books? What's going on when you're walking?
Well, if I have a podcast, it would definitely be the Modern Leadership Podcast.
And I'm not paying you for that, right?
You're not paying people for it. The truth is, though, at one time I was furiously listening to a lot of podcasts, and I still will occasionally. But lately I've been going with a blank sheet of paper in my head, right? Like just sort of blank it out. And because I feel like we get a tremendous amount of technological noise, and it's important for me to reconnect to my inner wisdom, that little voice inside of me. And I can't do that if I'm listening to, sort of outside things. I do. So I guess I'm shifting. I do a lot of podcast listening, but the walk is starting to become sacred ground for me.
And the listeners of this podcast have heard me talk about this a lot, Bill, but I believe one of the biggest challenges in leadership right now is this inability to be still, to really think and be proactive because of all the disruption, because of all the constantly on through texting and all the different connections that we have. We're constantly reacting instead of being proactive. And I love this idea that you get out, you go with a blank sheet of paper in your head to really be proactive of what your business needs. And maybe you don't intentionally go out often walking for ideas, but they seem to find you anyway.
Exactly. And, one thing that I don't know if I'm proud of, but it's sort of notable. I've written 5 books, and my very first book is called Right Risk: 10 Powerful Principles for Taking Giant Leaps with Your Life. And it has 10 principles. The very first principle of the 5 books that I've written, and all the paragraphs and stories of everything, the first principle is find your golden silence. And I have a quote in the beginning of that chapter from John Prine, the great sort of Americana folk singer. And it, basically it's you got gold inside of you, and you do, but we don't access that gold enough. We try to get too many of our answers from outside of ourselves when there's real wisdom inside of yourself if you allow yourself to listen.
You know what's really interesting, and this is going to be fascinating to the listeners of the podcast, but they're not going to know it for a couple of months because I do recording in advance. This week, I actually published a blog post called Prospecting for the Inner Gold, 5 ways that you can find the inner gold within you. And I love that idea, and I find it very, I don't know if irony is the right word, but it's amazing how the universe tends to choreograph these conversations and these thoughts and things come up. And it's based on, have you heard the story of the solid gold Buddha in Thailand?
No. If I have, it's vague, so remind me.
So there was this Buddha that was created in India in about 1300, and it was gifted to Thailand. And at the time, there was a bunch of wars and a bunch of fighting, so they covered this Buddha in plaster. And then through the wars, it got damaged and so on. And it laid for 500 years, just nobody noticed it. And then in the 1900s, the king of Thailand decided to rebuild some of the Wats or the temples in Thailand. And he used these historical artifacts. So they went and got this Buddha and they moved it in, and it became this really famous Buddha. Well, in the 1960s, they were moving it and they lifted it with a crane, and one of the straps broke. And when it broke, it fell and cracked the plaster that was over it. And they realized the inside was the largest solid gold Buddha ever made. They didn't know it. It was covered in plaster this entire time. And now, of course, it's a famous site that you can go see in Bangkok and see it. But that, I think, is what happens a lot to us. We have this gold within us, and we need to be chipped a little bit or dropped a little bit in order for it to be exposed.
Oh, man, that's a great metaphor. I love that. Yeah, we're into something here neither one of us planned for in this conversation, right? I mean, that's terrific.
Well, and that's what I love about these podcasts. But because your time is valuable, I got to ask you about this 10th anniversary edition of Courage Goes to Work. And the reason is there's this study that was done in 2018 by Warbles. And one of the things that they say in there is reasons why people stayed silent, or the why I stayed silent list. And they talked about things like people didn't speak up at work about things like discrimination or bad attitudes or theft or harassment. And they didn't speak up because of fear of being labeled, fear of their managers, fear of retaliation, fear of losing their jobs, all sorts of fear that stopped them from speaking up. And this has been on my mind for the last couple of weeks because I deal with a lot of business owners who their teams are afraid to speak up to them, or they're afraid to reach out to their team and say, hey, you're not doing the job I hired you to do. So I love this concept, courage goes to work. And I want to dive into it and talk on it for a little bit with you.
Absolutely.
So 10 years ago, you came up with this idea. What was the kind of the background? What did you see in the workplace that you needed to write this book?
Well, I was trying to plumb my own experience. They tell you to write about what you know, and I had this very unusual experience. As you know from reading the book, got plenty of legitimate experience, right? I was with Accenture in their change management and human performance practice. I did 300 team building events with Executive Adventure. I worked for a small boutique consulting company that is still around, and I worked with a guy who was a Vietnam veteran, knew a lot about leadership. All that stuff is good. Before all of that, graduate school, and before graduate school, I was a member of the U.S. high diving team, and I used to dive from 100-foot platforms into small pools for a living, traveling at speeds in excess of 50 miles an hour, protected only by a Speedo.
Yikes.
And I'm afraid of heights, and that's the whole thing. So I started out with a profound fear of heights, but through a coach and a leader in my life who nudged me out into discomfort and held me accountable to my own potential, eventually I was able to become out of the hypnosis from the domination of fear over me. I'm still afraid of heights, but it no longer dominates me. I certainly have enough courage that I can go up and to heights that I wasn't able to, years ago. So I wanted to take that experience and somehow, how could it be useful to people in a workplace? And what I realized was that many workplaces are still bastions of fear. And many, if not most, leaders still use fear and fear stoking in order to motivate people to get things done. They think they're doing it for the right reason. They might have motives and their intention might be in the right place. But the end result is they are putting fear inside of people and not courage inside of people. They're in-fearing people. And I call those leaders spillers because they displace your courage. They cause you to be discouraged. So I was thinking, why isn't there any literature? Why isn't there any business advice? Why aren't there any workshops about how to be more courageous in the workplace? Because so many things connect to it. To be a leader, you've got to render bold decisions that some people are going to disagree with, and that takes courage. To be a business developer means to knock on hundreds of doors in the face of rejection over and over again. That takes courage. To be an innovator means to experiment, to draw outside the lines, maybe make some forward-falling mistakes, and the greatest innovations almost always start out as blasphemy. So to be an innovator, you got to be a blasphemer, and that takes courage. So I just started thinking about all the things in the workplace that connect to this basic operating system of courage. Even presentation skills require courage. Even negotiation skills require courage. Even giving people tough feedback requires courage. And yet there was no there were books that were too theoretical. There were a few books that were, fully written by academicians and not relatable. And so I figured my unique experience, having mastered my fear of heights, if I tempered it and thought, what did I learn about courage? Could it be useful to people in the workplace? And that sort of gave birth to Courage Goes to Work.
Yeah. And I mean, this is so valuable for the workplace today because I think, and you talk about this idea of comfearable, which is this combination of comfort and fear within the workplace. And I see it on a daily basis. I deal with mostly I work with lawyers who are building their law firms, and I do a lot of coaching with them. And this is what we see is a lot of people that fall into routine. They feel really good about doing the tasks that they're really good at, but reaching outside of those tasks is very difficult for them for the reason of fear. And I want to throw a scenario out to you and kind of get your perspective on it. And so I have this lawyer that I've been working with, and she has a salesperson on her team. And the salesperson is very good at doing activity A, which is not a top priority. Let's say it's number 2 on the list of priorities. She's not very good at doing activity B, which is number 1 on the priorities. I know I used a lot of letters and numbers, but what I'm saying is she loves doing something that is not, and she's very good at it, that is not the highest and best use of her time or the owner's pay for her, but she falls into that routine. An example would be somebody who's really great at reading email, but very difficult for them to pick up the phone and make a call. So talk to me a little bit about how I can work with this employee to help them do what they need to do.
Well, it's a little bit challenging because, we tend to do better in the areas that we have passion for. But as you know, a person can become comfortable. They can become comfortable with low levels of fear or ensconced in complacency, right? They do what their routine has taught them to do, and they're good at it. They master it. They have full competency there, and so they don't want to do anything else. And now they're adding less value to the organization. I think that in a situation like that, what I would probably do is reconvene with that person and set goals that look out 6 months from now and focus on the condition you want with the person and invite them into that conversation. Here's what we need. Here's what the organization needs. Here's what I need. Here's how I need you to fill it. What's your space in this? And then ask that person for their ideas on what kind of development do they need so that they can have more motivation to that place. In other words, it really comes down to kind of two words, Jake. Set expectations, right? Really clear expectations, but involving the other person because they are the ones that have to do it and they have to be vested and invested in it. So get their ideas for shaping the how part, but set the expectations and then set the dates for inspection. And it sounds a little bit harsh, but the two words that matter a lot to management are expect and inspect. It's not enough to set the expectations and then constantly complain about how disappointed you are because the person didn't do the thing. You also occasionally have to inspect, and that's good management too. And that means periodically getting together and reviewing the progress that this person is making or isn't making towards that goal that you have jointly established.
And as we do this interview, the economy in the United States is in a solid position where unemployment is very low, historic low unemployment. And I want to talk a little bit about the fear that an owner has in maybe calling out their employees for fear that they're just going to walk out or holding them accountable. You talk about inspecting. And what about the fear that an owner has of inspecting and then losing their team?
Right. Well, there's a way to do it too, because like I talked about, you don't want to be a fear stoker, right? And use threat, for example, and point a finger in a person's face. You can do it in a principled way, and do it without having to be a jerk, like something that you've written about. And I know I saw on your website and such and blogs around that idea. I think it comes down to principles. I mean, I had a boss that was, and by the way, I call this kind of boss a filler. Somebody who puts courage inside of you by holding you accountable to your own potential and not letting you turn away from it and not allowing you to go to a lower standard because it's easier. They lift our standards. The best leaders bring out better in us and cause us to be better and ask what's better of us. And so I think of this leader that I worked for. His name was Heinz Brannon when I was at Accenture, and he could be tough on me, never in front of people, never in a demeaning way that made me feel small, but he would call me on it. Like if I had broccoli in my teeth after lunch, he was the guy that was going to tell me that I did. But I knew that he cared about me, and this is an important thing. I got to spend some time with Ken Blanchard. As you know, Ken Blanchard has written 70 books. One of them, the most famous probably, is The 1 Minute Manager. And in a conversation with him, I said, Ken, why do we even still have jobs as leadership development professionals? People have instant access to contemporary management thought. He said, Bill, I think it comes down to 15 minutes. I said, what do you mean? He said, I think every week or 2 weeks, you should be sitting down with each individual who reports to you. And for those 15 minutes, it has nothing to do with you getting status from them on where they're, how they're tracking on the goals that you set for them. Because you do that all the time anyway. That's what the status meetings are about. That's what your performance appraisals are about. But these 15 minutes are just devoted to paying attention to that worker and what's going on with them. Where are they wanting to develop? What are some skills that they want that they haven't yet had the opportunity to have? What do they want to lead in the organization? In other words, if you amp up, Jake, the caring of somebody and you become invested in them as a leader, it gives you a lot more latitude when you are direct with them. And now that person isn't going to leave because they know that you're being tough on them, not because you're a jerk or you're only fixated on the results that they're going to get for the organization or you, but they are now convinced that, no, this person actually cares about me and they're trying to make me better. They're not just trying to have me produce another golden egg. They're trying to make me a better person and a more capable professional in the workforce. And I'll stay for a person like that.
Yeah, and this topic is so valuable. I hope the listeners are really paying attention to what you're talking about, because you get more from work than just a paycheck. And this is an opportunity for us as leaders, as managers, as owners, as bosses to lean in more than just, hey, how's the family? But really asking the deep questions to really understand where somebody's coming from, what they're motivated by, what direction they're going, what their goals and dreams are. And I'm reminded we started this conversation talking about Bill Campbell and the $1 trillion coach. And one of the things that jumps out to me is he wouldn't just ask, hey, how's the family? He would ask, how was your daughter's soccer game? And that little nuance showed that he cared more than just going through the routine. And how can we do that as business owners?
You just keyed me in onto something I'd really love to share with your listeners. It's an embarrassing experience of my own that taught me such a profound lesson. So there was a fellow that worked for me in the early parts of my business, and he had come over from Accenture, the company that I left, and then he subsequently left and he started working for me. Great guy. I love the guy, and he's still a great friend of mine. His name is Ali Moore. And Ali had worked for me for about a year. I'd made him president of my company. And after that first year, I'm having a performance review with him, telling him, hey, you're doing good over here. Here's some areas where I'd like you to change and stretch. And then just to be a progressive leader, I said, Ali, is there anything I can do for you to be a better leader? And he said, well, Bill, there is one thing. He said, but I'd like to pose it as a question. What are the names of my two kids? And I didn't know. And I was embarrassed because he had told me stories about Alicia and Kellen many times, but I was always fixated on. I'd be like, yeah, that's good. Hey, where are we on the deal with the Johnson program? Hey, did you get that deliverable done? You know, I was always worried about that stuff, right? It was always the next thing that I had to have him do for me to produce. But he'd be telling me stuff about his kids, and I would like sort of make pretend I was listening, but I wasn't listening, and it taught me that. You know, that was right in my face. I mean, basically, he held up the mirror to me, and it showed me, you know, the truth is that I haven't paid enough attention to him and my treatment of him. And I've been all fixated about my worries and anxiety about the results that I needed him to get for the business. And that was a profound lesson for me.
Yeah, and that's a lesson that's worth the price of admission for the listeners of this podcast, because that is something you will never forget. And it really resonates with us as listeners that we say, you know, how many times do we go down that same path and maybe we haven't had the same experience, but that really tells us, you know, how much do I care? And when I talk to business owners that are afraid of losing their people, they're afraid of losing the productivity of their people. Are they afraid of losing the human, the person that has come to work for them? And how important is that?
Oh, it's hugely important. You know, Kim Scott wrote a book called Radical Candor. It's a terrific book. Basically, it's around courageous communication, although I don't know that she outright says that, but that's really what the book is about. And she talks about, you know, if all you are is just sort of the candid part, and you're a blunt force object, and you are, quote unquote, brutally honest, that's just violence in your language, right? On the other hand, if all you are is mushy gushy caring and never about getting work done, that's going to be what she called, I think, manipulative empathy. I might have that wrong, the empathy part, but regardless, her whole point is you've got to be amped up on both. You've got to have genuine, actual caring for the human being in front of you. And that gives you a lot more latitude to be able to be direct with that person in a way that won't hurt them, but that you know that they'll know that your motive is to help them, not hurt them. And so, you know, I guess it comes down to ends and means. A lot of leaders, a lot of business owners fixate on results. I mean, you know, that's how leaders are judged. Do they get the results? Particularly
as the company gets bigger. As the larger the company, the more results oriented they tend to be based on, you know, shareholders and things like that, outsiders looking in and staying, you know, ahead of the competition.
Absolutely. And yet, a leader's very success is dependent upon the productivity and performance of the people that they're leading. And you get great performance through the treatment of those people. And those are means. So you have means and ends. People become the performance that you'll get. And your treatment of them are the means, but the output is the results. But if you're only fixated on, the Aesop fable of the goose and the golden egg, give me another golden egg. Hey, you made a golden egg yesterday. You can make it faster today. I want 2 golden eggs today. If all you're focused on is the production of that person, and you're not focused on the treatment of that person and making sure that they are growing, developing, that you're putting into them, investing in them so that they're becoming more capable, then why should they put another golden egg out for you? If you don't really care about them, why shouldn't they go to an organization that will care about them? So if a business owner is worried about a person leaving, if they're going to be direct with them, then that means they haven't amped up enough time on the caring dimension, and that person probably should leave if they can go to a place where somebody's going to treat them better.
Wow. I think that's perfect. I think you just brought it home for us, and it really is something that resonated, a light bulb experience with me, Bill. I really appreciate that. Now, in your book, you talk about fillers and you talk about spillers, and we talked about that a little bit on this episode. And as our time runs down here, we need to shift gears. I want to tell the audience, the listeners, that you've got 3 types of courage that your book drives into. And can you just give us a real high level, what are the 3 that we can look forward to picking up the book and learning about?
Sure. First of all, I think it's a mistake to think that all courage is the same, because that's when we start to feel dwarfed by this big, ambiguous, amorphous thing called courage. And we start feeling intimidated by the very notion that maybe I'm courageous. But if you break it down to size, and what I've done is look at it from 3 different behavioral dispositions that I call try, trust, and tell. Try courage is the courage of first attempts. When you haven't done something before and now it's your first time doing it, you're crossing a certain threshold. Other people are doing the thing or have done the thing, but for you it's your first time, and it's the courage of action, initiative, and first attempts, and it takes the application of energy, and of course you could wipe out and hurt yourself. The second bucket of courage isn't about action. Sometimes it's releasing my need to control or my need to be right, and it's to experience trust, and we call it trust courage. It's the courage of an emotional vulnerability, getting disarmed, in trusting somebody else, sometimes following somebody else's lead. The risk here is if I entrust you and you betray me, now you hurt me. So I may have hurt myself with try courage because I wiped out, but if I entrust you, you could betray me and hurt me, and thus the risk and why it takes courage. The third bucket of courage, the one that we classically think of in the workplace, the person with the shaking voice asserting an unpopular opinion, I call it tell courage, the courage of voice or assertiveness, the courage of the truth teller, giving direct feedback to a direct report, giving lateral feedback to a peer who's not pulling their weight, sometimes giving upward feedback to a boss that isn't upholding the value system of the organization. So being truthful with one another and not biting your tongue to go along and get along. And you talked about it before. It's a big fear, people telling truth. And one of the reasons it's a fear is because they're afraid that if they say the truthful thing, they might be cast out of the tribe. They won't belong anymore. And so wanting to fit in and wanting to belong, they bite their true sentiments about things and swallow them.
And each of these 3 buckets of courage, I think, could be standalone episodes. And really looking at the trust courage, the one about relinquishing control. And as I talk to these owners and these business leaders on a daily basis, delegation and trusting your team and knowing that they're probably going to stumble and maybe fall down a little bit, but allowing them, like the child learning to walk, to experience setback and rise from it. I think each of these could be an independent podcast episode, but unfortunately, our time today is running to an end, and we need to shift gears and talk about learning from leaders. So what I'm going to do, Bill, is I'm going to make sure that there's a link to this book on the episode show notes and tell each of our listeners to go out, grab a copy, and really dive into these 3 topics of try, trust, and tell, these buckets of courage. But for now, can we shift gears and talk about learning from leaders?
Absolutely. And I love your idea. Maybe we'll do 3 separate podcasts in the future around try, trust, and tell. But yes,
I'm going to hold you to that.
Sounds good.
It's recorded.
I trust you will. Good.
All right, my friend. The first question that I have for you is the book currently on your Kindle or bedside table. What are you reading these days?
So I'm reading The Second Mountain by David Brooks, famous New York Times writer. And he's really shifted his focus recently on character and the importance of character. He went through some tough life experiences, but The Second Mountain is sort of the second stage of life wherein you start giving back and really relying on character. Haven't gotten deep into the book yet, but that's what I'm reading.
Well, I love the concept and the idea, and it's something that I want to explore a little bit further. Our second question then is your leadership superpower.
I think I've often told people that if I was ever to open like a ranch where people come and they sort of, decompress and such, that I would call it the Day Moon Ranch. And that is because I sometimes feel like the moon out in the daytime, like when you see the big moon in the morning at like 10 o'clock in the morning, and you look at it and you're like, you're not annoyed that it's there. You think it's kind of okay that it's there. It's out of place, but it's there. I'm like that. I'm like the observer, right? Like people are not threatened by me being in a group of other people and offering my observations and being there. I'm not part of the group. I'm distant from the group, but I'm a healthy observer of what goes on in group processes. I call myself the Day Moon.
Well, I love this idea, but what I think is more fascinating is that you've tied that experience, that personality trait, that as your superpower. And how does that make you a better leader?
I think because it allows me to be a keen observer. First of all, it helps me with group process or even individual observation as an executive coach. And I think it makes me a better writer because I can key onto original insights versus, sort of tried and true stuff that everybody else has written about. I just observe things in a slightly different way. So it certainly helps me, the power of observation. It's along the lines of being, taking those hour and a half walks is really part of that observation construct.
It's a great superpower, and I love that you shared it. The next question is a motivational philosophy quote or mantra, something that you live by.
Well, the simplest one would be 2 words, be courageous. Those words, when I am confronting a tough situation or a perplexing situation, or I have a lot of fear going on or anxiety in me, I'll ask myself, what's the next courageous thing to do? So be courageous. And I also love this quote from Mark Twain. Good judgment is the result of experience, and experience is the result of bad judgment. That's one of my favorite quotes, because you got to get out there and make some mistakes to learn.
Get chipped up, get dropped a little bit, and find that solid gold Buddha within inside you.
Yes, I love that metaphor.
All right, our final question then is the book that you most often gift or refer to friends.
Well, I've referred to a lot of leaders. It's an unexpected little book, but it's by Stanley Milgram. You may remember the if you call it a game or the theory, 6 degrees of separation. He's the person who sort of invented the Kevin Bacon game, although he never knew that because he's now deceased. But Stanley Milgram did a lot of interesting studies, and he did some studies on authoritarianism and how easily people capitulate to authoritarian leaders. And it took very little for people to what they thought was delivering fatal levels of electric shocks to people. Ultimately, it wasn't. It was a ruse, but there were studies done at Yale and now major universities throughout the world. But he wrote a book called Obedience to Authority. And there's plenty of great books about how to be a great leader. But I think it's very important for people in leadership development to be very attuned to the fact that the most destructive and catastrophic decisions of humanity have often involved leadership too. And it's very easily to capitulate to bad leadership. And that this is a book that I give to people and recommend to people so as they move in their leadership, they don't get so seduced with power that they don't recognize that it can be used for bad too, leadership.
What a great way to kind of come full circle in this conversation that we've been talking about with courage in the workplace, courage within ourselves, courage as leaders, and not just courage as leaders, but courage as followers as well. Bill, this time has flown. Thank you so much for coming on. Before we let you go, how do we find out more about you? How do we connect? Where do we go to pick up these great books?
Sure. Well, thanks again, Jake, for having me on. I really enjoyed it. It was a pleasant, unexpected conversation in the way that was like super full of surprises that I really enjoyed. And I hope we do keep our promise for future sessions. Your listeners can find me in a number of ways, BillTreasurer.com, CourageBuilding.com, or if they want to really have to spend a lot of time typing, GiantLeapConsulting.com.
and they don't have to type anything because we're going to link them all up on the show notes. Bill, we will keep our promise. We definitely got to dive into these 3 buckets of courage, but thank you for coming on, being this week's Modern Leadership guest expert.
My pleasure. Thanks again for having me.
All right, my friends, what did you think of that? I had so much fun. I mean, I hope the time flew as fast for you as it did for me. If you're on the treadmill, or if you're doing the dishes, or if you're on your commute to work, I hope that you really enjoyed that deep dive with Bill Treasurer. I had an absolute blast. I love this concept of courage goes to work. And, as I do my coaching, as I do my consulting with these different organizations and groups, it's something that comes up often. Having team members that are courageous to do what they need to do, or as an owner, a business leader, as a boss, having the courage to do what needs to be done for your team, for your business, for growth. I just love the idea. Of course, everything that we talked about in this episode can be found at jakeacarlson.com/ML147. And after we hit stop on the recording, guess what? Bill and I were talking about having him back to really dive into those 3 buckets: the trust, the try, the tell. I think we'll definitely need to have him back. But until next week, I want to wish you the very best of days, an even better life. And remember, everything is figure-outable. Thanks for listening to the Modern Leadership Podcast. You can find me on Facebook at Speaker Jake, on Twitter at Jake A. Carlson, and of course the website, jakeacarlson.com. See you there.